welcome to this this webinar where we're going to be talking about, it's a full-on hefty subject, so I hope you've all had your you're ready to concentrate, but it's beyond fact checking, exploring real world harms from misinformation and disinformation. And fittingly, it's a webinar put on by the PRCA as part of PR Ethics Month. So thanks so much for the PRCA for coordinating this. My name is Ben Smith. I'm the founder of PRmoment, and I'm chairing today's session, which will last about an hour. We may come in on a little bit under that, but we definitely won't go over it. And on the panel joining me today is Shayoni Lynn, who is CEO and founder of Lynn, Lexie Kirkconnell-Kawana, who is CEO at Impress, and Jake McLeod, who is head of UK Digital Crises at Edelman. A little bit about our panelists today. Lexie has been CEO of Impress since April 2023, having previously occupied the role of head of regulation. So she knows all about regulation, and as she's coming at this side of things, I guess, as the Impress is the independent monitor of press and the independent press regulator in the UK. Lexie's a New Zealand qualified barrister and solicitor, and has worked for all forms of for lots of different forms of regulation. Previously, she was at the Advertising Standards Authority, for example. Also, we've got Shayoni Lynn, who, as I say, is CEO at Global, which is a strategic communications agency specializing in behavioral science, crisis communications, and public relations. And it's got a strong emphasis on ethical communications. And I think it's fair to say Shayoni is known for her work in integrating behavioral insights into campaigns to hopefully influence positive change. And we've got Jake, who's, as I mentioned earlier, is head of UK Digital Crisis at Edelman. He works on global campaigns for over 10 years, working with governments, private sector, NGOs, and the UN across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. And at Edelman, Jake leads the digital crisis work. The plan for today is to have a bit of a panel discussion and a Q&A amongst myself and my fellow panelists. Then we're going to break out to a couple of case studies, just short, sharp 5-minute case studies, just to I guess bring some practical insight into what we're talking about. And then we'll break for questions, which I'm hoping will be led from you guys, our audience. Always keen to make it as in these sessions as interactive as possible. So we're going to have about a panel Q&A for 20-25 minutes or so. Then the case studies 5 minutes each, so about 10 minutes. And then after that, lots of questions from you guys, our audience today. Thank you so much for joining us. The way the questions will work, I'll remind you in a moment or two, is that we'll, if you put them in the screen using the question format on LinkedIn, and then I shall ask those questions to our panelists. Okay, I think that is enough from myself. Our first question today is, well, all about misinformation and disinformation, as you know. And I suppose it's the current scope of the disinformation and misinformation problem, and how it's impacting our society. Shayoni, do you want to just give us a bit of a heads up on the state of play currently?
Yeah, sure. So I think when it comes to mis and disinformation, the scale is unprecedented, is probably the best way to encapsulate it. The World Economic Forum Global Risks Report lists it as the biggest short-term threat to society. It's in the top 5 long-term threats that we face. So we live in a world where, thanks to algorithms, engagement is prioritized over accuracy in terms of how it affects society. Of course, the real-world harms are there for all to see. We've seen it in the UK firsthand recently with the riots, what the real-world spillover from organized influence campaigns can look like. And this will only become worse as a problem over the coming months and the coming years. And in terms of how it affects society, from increasing hesitancy and reactance, for example, to life-saving vaccines, to reducing acceptability of key infrastructure projects that we need to develop and implement to reduce the harms from climate change and save our planet, disinformation plays a huge role in how we perceive our democratic processes, chipping away at the fundamental structures of democracy. And ultimately, this leads to reducing trust in institutions, reducing trust in experts, and reducing trust in the truth.
Lexie, it's a big old question, that one. But from a sort of regulation perspective, I suspect you have, well, you see a different side, but important element on how that misinformation, disinformation is impacting society.
Yeah, certainly. I think that Shayoni points out, obviously, this has huge effects on democratic institutions, on social cohesion, and the way we make sense of the world as individuals and as communities. But they also have, a lot of harmful effects in all aspects of public and private life. At an individual level, the personal harms that can occur because of this, but from the perspective of the business world, corporate brands the world over are really going to struggle in a context where people can't rely on and trust information. And we're starting to see some of the kind of worst effects of this as this becomes a really competitive landscape, particularly for our attention, and therefore seeing kind of corporate warfare around mis and disinformation, I think, is going to become relevant to our future as well. On the regulatory side, governments the world over don't know how to handle this problem because what's intrinsic to mis and disinformation, whether that's intentionally or negligently spread, is that this is about truth and accuracy. And that's never been very easy to define. It's held quite subjectively by a lot of people. And we are now finding ourselves at a time where the democratizing force of the internet, when it came along and meant that anyone in the world over could communicate with anyone else with an internet-enabled device, has meant that the ability to create guardrails around this, to create friction on some of those disinformation campaigns and flows is incredibly challenging, particularly when you've got over 190 legal jurisdictions and how they'll interact with each other on trying to address this problem as well.
Blimey, Lexie, there's more questions in that explanation than I'm going to talk to you about that. The practicalities of trying to regulate the entire world must be almost impossible, I suspect. But we shall come on to lots of those issues later as we work our way through these themes around misinformation, disinformation. But Jake, can I just come to you on a slightly academic point? Could you just outline us the difference between misinformation and disinformation and the difference between the two?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's a spectrum, right? So misinformation is the kind of unintentional, false or misleading information which is spread without an intent. So that is, your gran telling you to put cayenne pepper in your tea because it'll help your digestive system type thing. And then what we see a lot of from state actors, but also companies, is disinformation, which is the fabricated or deliberately manipulated content. So that is sharing false information with that intent, and that's what moves it from mis and disinformation. And I guess what we're also seeing a lot more of is malinformation, and this is particularly hard to combat because it is fake news that is built on the essence of truth. So it might be taking a statement out of context. It might be cropping a headline and showing it in a certain light. It might be attributing words that someone said to them in a different context. And for companies, politicians, brands, that is some of the hardest bit to combat because you've taken something very pithy and to the point that is traveling on WhatsApp, on social media, and you want to combat that by saying, well, technically, actually, what I meant was, and obviously that will turn off much of the mass public, and so much fake news is so much more appealing than the truth, is so much more compelling, and that's one of the real struggles that companies and organizations have challenging this.
Right.
Shayoni,
do you go on?
Yeah, sorry. You're probably going to ask me. I was just going to add to Jake's point. I think one of the key takeaways from the world of misinformation research is that sharing misinformation is not believing misinformation. So I think that's a key insight to hold on as we go through this conversation, is that just because you see a volume of noise does not necessarily mean that it's creating certain beliefs. And I think this is all about real world harms, this webinar, and I think where we need to focus our thinking is more on the spillover into belief systems. And ultimately, we're dealing with belief systems and identities. So to really understand whether the proliferation of false content, whether that is mal, or conspiracy theories, how does that affect belief systems, and how are new beliefs being embedded within populations?
Well, go on then. How are they?
Well, they are by the spread, but because essentially what we are dealing with is the psychology of human beings. We're dealing with a lot of insecurity, a world that is very different to what it used to be before the growth of the social media, generative AI, a splintered democratic process, or so it's perceived, high levels of uncertainty in several things, including migration and economy, etc. And what disinformation actors are doing are weaponizing those narratives to appeal to individual beliefs. So when you're looking at the information environment, it's really important to also assess how some of those information threats manifest within audience beliefs to understand the embeddedness of those false narratives within the population.
But what you also said there was that engagement or sharing isn't the same as believing something, which is an obvious but important point that I think is very often missed. How on earth do is there a way to understand whether someone is acting upon this piece of disinformation, I suppose, at a social media level?
Yeah, there's lots of motivators for people spreading false information, and specifically disinformation and influence campaigns. There's commercial gain to be had, there's political gain to be had, there's a lot of other factors. It's multifactorial. But in order to understand whether these are being circulated as a result of beliefs or being circulated as a result of particular gain, that's where the behavioral science aspect comes in, to really understand within populations whether what people observe online, how they share content online, does that really affect their belief systems? And that's why I think mixed methods research becomes really important to assess not just stated intent, not just things what people say, because often we say a lot of things to gain engagement, to have confirmation from our communities, really assess how is that affecting your personal belief system, and are you likely to do something as a result of that? Are you likely to walk out and participate in a riot? Are you likely to go and boycott a product? And those are the key questions to be asking when looking at a problem like this.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because I was going to frame that with your regulation hat on, Lexie. These things don't happen overnight, do they? But we quickly get involved in a channel algorithm which keeps feeding us content, and therefore over time, presumably, our beliefs and perhaps our actions do change.
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, that's what regulation is set out to do, right? We're not here to police free speech. If people want to engage in innocuous and harmful belief and non-harmful beliefs, they're entitled to do so. That's where your right to freedom of expression exists. You're allowed to have controversial and challenging ideas. Where we start to be concerned about the limits on that free expression and where that, regulation should come into play, where we start to see those harms proliferate. And the world over, there are lots of regulations around the kind of speech we have. Just recently in the UK, under the Online Safety Act, it's now become a criminal offence to knowingly spread false information. And we're starting to see the first arrests of individuals under criminal law for that. Shayoni mentioned Stockport. We're starting to see arrests emerge from that in relation to this new law. The challenging part of that, though, is interpretation of intent. And from a legal perspective, intent's really challenging in here because you have to show that someone knowingly spread information that was false. And so when we're talking about mis and disinformation, we do have to be careful. Yes, there's the academic tests, but if we're going to try and curb this and stop this, we need to be very careful about the legal tests therein. And I can tell you that having evidence built around someone's intent to spread false information is a very challenging bar. So when we start to see the first cases emerge on the other side of this and understand how intent's being understood by the courts, we'll know a little bit more about what those thresholds are for when the state is going to get involved and actually clamp down on some of this speech.
Right. And historically, I mean, clearly there's always been propaganda, there's always been misinformation, there's always been disinformation. Where are we, from your perspective, Lexie, on is it the case, where we always think now we've got social media and digital media and numerous social media channels that we've now got all of that on steroids? Historically, are we at a bad place, or has it forever been thus?
I think the challenge is we haven't had a conversation, a sort of democratic conversation about how we should be using and experiencing information through these new mediums, right? Because historically, the traditional gatekeepers around getting access to trusted, truthful, accurate information were institutions like traditional news media, institutions like academia, institutions like government, and government agencies. And now that's been completely disaggregated because you can get information from everywhere. And there was no conversation when social media emerged, when search engines emerged, about what that would mean when it would dovetail with these private organizations that are private companies, multinational companies, now some of the largest companies in the world, in terms of how we would participate as societies, as communities, with that information access. And so when we think about this issue of on steroids, the scale of it, I think we have to have a conversation about where are we trying to get to? Because it's from my perspective, it's not going to be an effective solution to just try and dampen and quell the cat that's out of the bag. We have to be really, really careful about what's the information future we want, so that if we're going to start intervening on it, we get closer to there and don't create a whole bunch of perverse outcomes that we didn't want to anticipate as well. People's instinct is like, oh, well, let's clamp down on social media, let's clamp down on search. The fact is that those are fundamental now to our day-to-day life. And so we need to be doing that visioning work and understand, well, where's the point we want to get to? What are going to be the information gatekeepers of the future, and how do we get there?
I'm thinking AI all of a sudden, but go on, Jake. Same question to you.
I was going to build on that and just say that I think as well, not only the challenge for us is that a lot of the social media issues and the mis and disinformation we're seeing are symptoms of the polarization we're seeing across the country. And this is why we're also, Edelman's obviously a global company. We do research on trust across the world, and we've seen that mis and disinformation is particularly high, prevalent, and impactful in countries where they are more polarized, where their society has more us versus them than is a more cohesive group. And that is what has changed a lot in the last, particularly, I think, 30 years, where, the UK, to talk locally, has changed in terms of the pace. And I think to talk about the AI bit, there's two elements of that. There is one, the role that AI plays in creating and spreading misinformation. It makes it cheap and easy and more dynamic, and detractors can now create fake content in seconds rather than, a bit more effort, which I think did apply a certain level of pausing. But the other role that AI is going to play over the next few years is our whole society is going to change, and there is going to be, if we're not careful, people that are left behind in that change. The jobs we will be doing in 10 years will not be the jobs that people were doing 10 years ago. And when we've seen those seismic shifts in society and culture, and when work has moved at that pace, it has deepened that polarization. And I think that is one of the big societal issues that we're going to continue to face. And this aspect that we're talking about today is one fallout and symptom of that, and a confluence of events that will continue to play a role in the coming years.
And Jake, when you're looking at these things from a global perspective, I suppose to an extent anyway, centering on disinformation for a moment, is that coming from a state and government level in the main? Do we tend to see much brand on brand disinformation?
We definitely do see a lot of brand on brand disinformation. I remember one of the first pieces of work that I dealt with in Edelman when I joined was a company just announcing a completely fake partnership with our client. It was completely false, but it got them a boost on their stock exchange. And it was a real challenge for that client about what did they say? What were they bound to do? How did they manage that? And this other company just pushed this out. It was to their own benefit, knowing that it was a difficult space for my client, which was a large multinational, versus this small startup. That didn't happen by accident. That is intentional fake news and disinformation for their commercial benefit. I think we're also seeing in the more consumer side, there's a lot of conversation around natural, organic, things like that. There was just a plethora of company on company mis and disinformation about what products are good, who's poisoning who, and we're seeing a lot of that work happen at a kind of low level underneath, and it points spiking up. In the US, for instance, there's a massive conversation around aluminium in products. People are really obsessed with it there in a way that we aren't, and that is something that has been weaponized by kind of alt-right extremists now who think aluminium is poisoning them. And so they are kind of going in and destroying clients' deodorant brands because it has aluminium in it and things like that. So we're seeing that real impact and how that's playing out. And a lot of the sourcing back we can see is people who, there is clearly paid for bot activity and someone is putting time and money and effort into that. And, a state actor doesn't care about some deodorant on the store in Walmart, but another brand does. And I think that's pretty clear where the kind of start of that happened.
Shayoni, when you're talking to your clients about these issues, what do you see? What do you advise them as the most important elements of this that they need to think about? Is it the trust in the media element, or is it more specific problems that might crop up to them?
I think so. When we typically work with governments and NGOs on these issues, although we've done some consumer work. So it's really interesting hearing Jake's views. I think fundamentally, we are seeing a splintering of democratic process and values and the systems that we hold dear as a population. And there are big threats to that. So a lot of the disinformation spillovers we see in the real world are driven by some extremely baseless global conspiracy theories. So when you look at the UK riots, that was driven by a extremely famous, albeit baseless, conspiracy called the Great Replacement Theory, which claims that the white population in the West is under siege by an immigrant population from the global South, and the only way for the white population to survive is through a genocidal race war. Now, that sounds absolutely insane, but between that global conspiracy theory and that foot soldier on the ground that walks out and decides to set a bin on fire, there are layers and layers of personalization. There's a lot of content being created and crafted to really make that accessible to the person who then takes action. So I think that's something worth noting, is a lot of the stuff that we see on the ground are driven by some really what we might consider insane conspiracy theories. And to understand some of the stuff on the ground, we need to know those umbrella conspiracies to understand how they're filtering in and how they're leveraging population's psyche to bring them over to their side in many ways. The way we advise clients, first and foremost, is about a mixed methods approach to information environment. I think a lot of the solutions in the marketplace are tech solutions, potentially with ML and AI built in. But what that tends to do is looks at the information landscape through the lens of volume or noise. So you're following the volume, you're following engagement. What it often fails to do is identify the signals from that noise. What is that noise telling you? What are the misinformation codes and cues that built within that noise that can help us predict what might happen in the future? We then take those information threats and we assess that against populations, as I explained earlier, is understanding how those information threats are manifesting in the real world. We then take a prioritization exercise to help clients better understand when to intervene and when not. And I think what often people miss out is a lot of the disinformation campaigns are created to trigger an emotional response in us. It's created for us to try and debunk and fact check. And that's what they want us to do. They want us to feed the algorithm. So often it's harder, but the right approach to not respond. And so having that assessment in place to understand when to respond, when not to respond, and when to do something proactively is really important. And then we take that sort of assessment to integrate that across external affairs. So it's a blend of both behavioral science and misinformation. But with the growth of generative AI, what we now know is that disinformation is at the fingertips of everyone pretty much. For $20 a month, you can create influence campaigns. How do you fight back? And that moves us from a reactive space to a more proactive space.
But define response, right? I mean, just watching it means that the algorithm will feed you more. You're not particularly sharing it, are you?
Yeah, and it's not even watching it. So if you look at X or Twitter, as I'll forever call it, the default is hate. So if you go, we have a lot of soft puppet accounts, which we use just to monitor and see how how the algorithm might treat you. And even when there's no activity on those accounts, you're being fed very radicalized content. So I don't even think it's at the point where you need to engage. Back in the day on YouTube used to be, if you saw something, it feeds you content similar to your interest. But right now the default is hate. So there's a lot that individuals have to do to stay beyond that. And a lot of this content is very sophisticated. It doesn't have to be extreme to be radicalized. And it is created to trigger our own biases and beliefs. So how do we create a long-term strategy where we can educate populations to be thinking more critically, to have more analytical reasoning? These are big questions, and we're not going to solve it overnight.
Well, I was going to throw it over to Jake to try and solve those fairly significant questions that Shayoni has posted.
I think how we maybe pause for a second. Yeah, I think how we respond to these different issues needs to be really holistic. I'm interested definitely in what Shayoni was saying about how that kind of matrix and framework for assessing when to respond, and that is really important. But I think it's also about who and how we respond. So there's lots of different ways that we can manage these issues. So for instance, when I was working around the pandemic on vaccine kind of hesitancy in Africa and the Middle East, I was working with a global conglomerate of NGOs and private sector individuals, and we're talking about what we do in Africa. And I think what was clear around the table was it wasn't coming from any of our groups, because we as white Westerners largely, we're not going to be the trusted individuals to deliver that message on the ground. And I think that is a really pertinent part that is slightly forgotten in some of the ways we tackle mis and disinformation, is who is the deliverer of that message and how do we get it in front of people is really important. And for certainly my clients, big brands, that is a challenge for them in rethinking how they frame up conversations with their audiences. And actually, it's not always the CEO that needs to be on CNN. It needs to maybe be people that look and sound more like the people you're trying to communicate with, and trying to really personalize that relationship, I think, is a really important way that we manage to shift views in the long term. And maybe just to talk quickly on how clients more broadly are protecting themselves. I think where we've seen clients really fall foul of mis and disinformation is when they are big and well known, but at a very surface level. So people actually don't know what they stand for. People don't know what that company does and what it believes in. So, and people are ready for them to trip up, right? So if people get told, well, actually, they've done an evil thing, and we've obviously seen a lot of this around Israel and Gaza in the, conflict there, where there's been a lot of different conversation around what companies have and haven't said and done, etc. And a lot of that people are quick to believe because, well, actually that company hasn't really said or done very much on these past issues. And we know that issues around mis and disinformation and geopolitics are now surpassing what executives in businesses are worried about. That's now surpassing the pandemic and other past issues, and they're really worried about the geopolitics and societal issues because the expectations on companies around that is really high, and the two are definitely really interlinked.
Actually, just over to you, I suppose. To what extent can regulation help with guiding us through this disinformation phase that we all seem quite worried about?
Because of the scale of the problem and the breadth and the fact that we're within, say the four legal walls of the UK, how much influence can we have over what happens in Pakistan or Macedonia or Russia in terms of disinformation campaigns? Very, very limited, right? Some soft power diplomacy, but otherwise, really, really challenging for regulation to act there. In the internal walls of the UK market and political economy, you're looking at, obviously, individual instances can be addressed through regulation. That can happen, but it's a bit of a game of whack-a-mole. You're not going to kind of unpack disinformation by policing every single shared piece of false information. It's entirely impractical. So instead, we have to look at distribution of information and how we can ensure that those key distribution and information gatekeepers are abiding by ethics and standards that ensure the information that flows through their mediums is accurate, truthful, objective, and not harmful. And so
you mean the channel owners, in essence?
Channel owners, I mean, a lot of the focus has been on social media platforms, and we now have new regulations in place regarding those platforms, but specifically, they're not going to address dis and misinformation. They're going to address speech that's already illegal. They're going to address systems and harms, but mis and disinformation was axed by the Conservative government in addressing that bill. So we don't actually have any regulation in place for those social media platforms, those distribution actors at that top end of the wedge, but they're not the only ones. And obviously, we promote that news media need to be effectively regulated as trusted sources of information for people in terms of providing that. But I think overall, when we're looking at regulation, we're looking at it as an ecosystem. We need to be I think we need to have a much more sophisticated conversation about who are the trusted sources of information in the UK. It's no longer just traditional media. There are influencers and creators that have far more audience and reach that are sitting and acting like individual citizens. When in fact you reach a certain level of audience, you take on new responsibilities, what I call a new type of fiduciary relationship with your audience. So we should be looking around what should regulation be in place for those brands that capture a huge amount of audience, but wouldn't necessarily identify themselves as publisher or a purveyor of information. And we should be thinking about what good regulation looks like around them as well. Because when we're talking about this, we're talking about incentives and disincentives to do this. Shayoni and Jake have talked a lot about there are commercial incentives in place to encourage dis and misinformation. So if we're going to be regulating, we need to be regulating to disincentivize, to take out the commercial benefits that flow from being a disinformer in an information ecosystem. And to do that, we need to address this new operating model we have of engagement, clicks, awareness, with no guardrails, being the higher order value that we place on information reaching individuals. If we take out those incentives, we find we'll probably be able to kind of put a lid on this and let it and let us come back to a more sort of calm and sensible information environment. But to do that is challenging, and we need to look at the operating models, and we need to go, actually, where can we create friction here to fundamentally change the way information is exchanged now.
Okay, because it's such an interesting balance, isn't it? Because at the same time, one of the reasons historically the UK has been a harder place for rogue states to influence is because we've had a strong independent media, right? So from what you just said, there's a balance there, isn't there? You need a media to be strong and independent and to do what historically it has done very well. But at the same time, at the moment, it's not quite working.
No, not at all. I mean, when we look at the media landscape right now, we look at who are those companies that are operating and how successful are they in terms of their business models, their audience. We're seeing massive collapse across the media. We now have 3 companies which own 90% of the news brands at national level in the UK. 6 companies own 70% of the UK regional market. So we're talking about a huge scale of collapse, and we know what's happening with print. We know print has died a death, and everyone's moving brands online. But some of the most followed TikTok accounts, Instagram accounts are some of these brands which still have that loyalty, that affinity. But increasingly, as I said, we're starting to see more and more people that don't necessarily identify themselves as new media, but are incredibly trusted sources of information. And this is particularly for the under 35 age demographic as well. They will tell you affinity to an individual influencer is far more important to them as a source of information, which they'll then go off and cross-reference and fact check than any individual news brand. And we're also starting to see the tipping point of people saying who their primary source of news is now online news sources as opposed to television and other historical brands. So this is an entirely new market that's emerging in terms of what we would call media and their function. Their function still is to inform their audiences, educate them, entertain them, share information with them and commentary with them, but they don't recognize themselves as a news market. They recognize themselves as, influencers, as creators. And, for any agency that is working right now, if you don't have a creator strategy, what are you doing? But thinking really carefully around what are the protections that they have in place, what's their ethics policy, working with these types of new media, because there isn't any regulation that sits around them or behind them.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? I mean, as a publisher, I always thought if I published something that was in essence a lie, I would get it would create some legal problems for me. But it's an interesting world that we now seem to be operating in, guys. We're moving through things from a time perspective. So can I just make it relatively quick fire, Jake? Just for a bit of fun, could you in about a minute or so identify what a good disinformation campaign looks like, and then I'm going to come to you, Shayoni, on how you would counter that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I'll give an example. So, really compelling piece of disinformation campaigning I saw in Kenya was people mocking up fake news articles to say that COVID vaccines were killing people. They looked kind of authentic, but also a bit gritty. And they were focused on, all of the existential fears that people already had that we now know really well, but at the time were quite new. And so, yeah, it was all through WhatsApp as well, which is very big. So it was very channel focused because that's the main way of communicating there. So there was it was both really compelling content, really channel specific, and just spread en masse because very large community WhatsApp groups are there. So the content, the tone, and the channel were all really effective.
Brilliant. Shayoni, I mean, that one specifically or more broadly, how would you, what are the secrets to counter disinformation?
Well, I don't think there are many secrets. I think a good disinformation campaign from a disinformation playbook, there are three things, right? Start small. It typically starts with a lone post here, a lone post there, which might seem innocuous. They don't have to be massively big for it to be the start of a disinformation campaign. Build with bots. Bot activity is hugely compelling when it comes to building disinformation campaigns. And bots by volume give it authenticity and veracity. And then you wait for receptive hosts. So it's very much like viral transmission. You wait for people who believe in misinformation or will share misinformation to further that narrative into the information ecosystems. In terms of countering it, there are several ways proactively and reactively to do that. The first, and the one that I insist on the most when speaking to clients, is investing in an early warning system. This is similar to social listening, but different in ways that they are built to identify misinformation, including specific codes by disinformation influencers. So, for example, with the UK riots, I keep referring to it because it's the most recent example of spillover. The first post that claimed the alleged attacker was an immigrant was by an individual called Eddie Murray on Facebook. And he used the phrase, enough is enough, which was a Labour cost of living campaign, but has since been hijacked by the far right to have an anti-migrant narrative. So an early warning system helps actively monitor that information environment, gather longitudinal data to understand the baseline, and identify deviations from that baseline. Now, we all know about fact-checking and debunking, but they're typically reactive responses. If you're fact-checking or debunking, you're potentially in a crisis already. So more proactive and preventative measures are things like pre-bunking, for example, so actively building immunity within your audience to help them identify common disinformation techniques that they might encounter when consuming information. There's also things around creating and spreading counter narratives. Of course, that's very, very important, using very similar methodology to disinformation actors. And I've mentioned long-term strategies like promoting critical thinking and analytical reasoning. So there's a bunch of things that you can do, but the key thing is to diagnose the problem correctly to better understand the interventions that will have the most impact.
Right. Now, the PRC are very keen, quite rightly, to make these webinars as practical as possible. And with that in mind, we just wanted to have a brief case study slot. So, Jake, I think you've got one first. If you just to talk through a case study of disinformation that you've worked on.
Yeah, definitely. So I just wanted to kind of talk through a case study. It's for a UN organization, and it's really to highlight that for global brands, they should take these kind of spikes of activity as warning signs, not as the end of the road. And we can, because of the way of digital and social, we can see that there's a lot of that issues can echo across the world. So I've been working, I was working with a UN agency who works in conflict zones, and within Ethiopia specifically, during the civil war about 2 years ago, this client had become the target of disinformation by either side. So they were naming them, either side was naming them as complicit in supporting the other. And what was interesting was that it was very specific about the product they provided. So it's a UN agency, they were providing food and resources to both sides as would be normal, but each side was saying, well, actually, we're getting less good food, we're getting unsafe food, and the other side are getting the good food. And that really ranked up tensions to the point that the leaders, both of the government and of the opposition party, were claiming that this organization was acting illicitly. And so we got involved to help them figure out the extent of that. And as Shayoni said, like, how much was that believed and what was the impact of that? And just as in Ethiopia, we were able to see that actually it put lives at risk. I mean, certain convoys weren't safe because people were spreading rumors that there was guns in them instead of food. And so very real life impact of that kind of thing. But what was really interesting was, as part of that research, we took samplings from 4 other countries. So one in Arabic, one which was Ukraine, and the other Yemen. And we could see the start of the exact same type of thing in there. So we could see that there was the essence of there was conversation around food quality, as there would be for an organization who's providing billions of grains of food every year. But what was important was we could see that at times that was being weaponized by community leaders at a very local level to say, well, actually, we're getting the worst stuff. And this other ethnic group that we are in combat with, whether it was a full-on war or just, in disagreement or racial tension, that was being used as they were being used as the kind of pawn in that. They were the political football in their argument. And what we really realized was that as an organization, as a UN agency, they spent a lot of time talking to the Western world about what they were doing and what they stood for and what their values were. What they didn't spend a lot of time doing was communicating in the countries they were operating in the local languages, via the local leaders that they work with there, about the work they were doing. So for a lot of people in these countries, they just saw the kind of white savior effect essentially. So they saw the UN as coming in, providing something, and actually, as people have got more wary of globalization and conspiracy theories around that have grown, we saw a lot of that come to play for them. So it was really interesting and helping them change. Not only the Ethiopian civil war is done now, so moved on from that slightly, but what was helpful to them was to be able for us to give them recommendations and approaches of how they could change their whole communications approach and their whole communications team to be more focused on solving that issue now before it ended up at the scale of Ethiopia. So I guess, my learning from that really is take those moments, those flashpoints, as warnings, not the end, because it can always get worse and it can always get more challenging for you. And because of the connectivity of social media and digital, like, geographical boundaries are no longer the end of it. So we see a lot of mis and disinformation travel a lot more through language, through countries with strong diaspora links than we do hopping over to the next country next door. So these issues are really important to think about as particularly for global organizations or anyone really, like they should need to view these issues as flashpoints and points where we can pivot and change rather than, well, that's done now and we can move on.
Right, some big learnings for the UN there. Thank you, Jake. Shayoni, do you have a brief case study you wanted to talk us through?
Very brief, yeah. So in 2021, we launched the Misinformation Cell, which was the first anti-mis disinformation service in PR and comms. So we worked through those years through Gen AI in multiple areas. So I'll just tell you about three key issues, areas I can reflect on. The first is at the start of the war at Ukraine. So we worked with the war team in Kyiv to develop a set of counter narratives. We did a rapid analysis of official and unofficial Kremlin propaganda and created a set of counter narratives that could be deployed by communications policymakers and journalists. And that was one of the first steps, I think, into the information environment that was so crucial and critical for Ukraine. So that was one really interesting piece of work we did. The second piece of work we did was leading Welsh government's 20 miles per hour campaign, which I'm sure many people on this call would have heard of. Now, if you look at the information environment, you'll probably think this is an extremely unpopular policy and it's not been implemented correctly. And to be honest, yes, there are questions around implementation. But going back to that initial insight of sharing is not believing, actually all the data shows how effective a policy it has been. It has been one of the most effective policies out of the Senate. Within 3 months, there's been a lot of independent research into this, which demonstrates that speeds, more than half motorists dropped their speeds. We've had the lowest casualties on record, and it saved the NHS £3.7 million in 3 months. So again, going to show that even though the information ecosystem is filled with a lot of false narratives and misinformation about the policy, on the ground, people are reducing their speeds. And the third piece was a piece of work we did in North America. A bunch of brands, some of the biggest global brands in the world, who were hit, very similar to Jake's story actually, hit by a disinformation campaign by a competitor in a different territory that basically spilled into the US and threatened the ban of a substance. And if that substance was banned, it would have affected that industry to the tune of $12 billion US. We were brought in as part of a consortium. We did a rapid analysis, a perception study, and what we identified was where these brands who had been affected were very focused on the policy side of things, rightly so. What happens if this substance is banned? We found huge gaps in the information environment within the consumers. Consumers were buying these products without having any affinity with these brands, without knowing how to use these products. And there was this huge vacuum that was rife for manipulation. So we were able to give that insight to the team to help them think in a complementary way, both in terms of policy and lobbying, but also about ensuring that consumer knowledge and understanding and acceptability was maintained.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Both of those case studies, we could do a whole new show on just those. I've got lots of questions, but unfortunately we don't have the time for me to ask them right now. You'll have seen in the chat a post there. So please, guys, if you're listening to this and do want to ask any questions, fire them in there, and I will ask them of our panelists. Couple last ones from me before I wrap up my questioning. The role of the PR community in this, quite often a fair few people shoot at the ethics of the PR sector. And Lexie, I'm keen to get an external perspective on that, if I may. First of all, where do you see the role of PR in either countering disinformation or perhaps, dare I say, creating it?
Certainly. I mean, the fact is that in the absence of good law and regulation, that's going to come at the hard end of this. What we need is sectors to take that corporate social responsibility approach and look at what is their contribution to what we know is a harmful and impactful problem across communities, across society. If the sector itself is not going to come together and come up with standards for addressing this sort of problem, individual companies need to think about what is their responsibility, what's their contribution, and factor that into your strategies and decision making. So, as I said before, number one, what are the suppliers and information providers you're working with, and are you sure that they've got the right kind of guardrails in place, particularly around publishing and integrity, that makes them a trusted information brand that you'd be willing to work with. And if you've done that supplier assessment and you're confident that you're not working with media brands, for example, that engage in inaccuracy and hate speech, that you're engaging with influencers and creators and other sources to ensure that they've got standards in place. That's the first key thing you can do. Second, it's looking at more upstream. What ways are you going to be actively contributing to these campaigns, or not, through, again, the system of incentives that are in place? If all your concern is about client landing message and engagement, that's a pretty poor starting point in terms of looking at how to address disinformation as a wider social phenomenon. But as I said, it's up to brands to make those choices consciously, and up to PR as a sector to think really, really carefully about that contribution.
Jake, question to you, I suppose. What do you see public relations as a creator of truth, or do you think things are a little bit more complicated than that?
I think we, as a sector, have done a lot in recent years, and I think a lot of that's been driven by regulation around greenwashing and the Online Safety Act and others that are happening in places to look at the integrity of information. I think as a crisis practitioner, what we get to do, because we're not just there when the fire is happening, but we're thinking about risk as well, is really try and elevate that bar and help clients understand the value of elevating that bar, of being really comfortable with their truth, which I think is also part of it. Like, clients want to put something in the absolute best light, and I understand that, but it's also about making sure it's really authentic, and where you aren't doing enough and where there is criticism, then getting quite comfortable with that, I think, is quite helpful. And us as PR and PR practitioners, I think we could do a lot more to support our clients to understand that, and to help them be able to communicate really authentically, because that is what builds trust more than anything, more than the most compelling message in the world. A lot of truth and consistency is what will get you the brand loyalty, the bump in your shares, whatever that looks like. It will be about the consistency. People want to work with brands that mirror their ethics. That's really clear and is consistent in every market in the world now. So I think that's something that we all need to kind of get on board with.
Right. Shayoni, what do you see as the role of the PR community globally, I suppose, about countering misinformation and disinformation?
I think it's a big part of who we are and what we need to do, but I don't think it's a communications problem. This needs to ladder up to C-suite. This needs to be part of risk and compliance. Communicators will be at the front lines fighting this, but cannot sit within communications. And I think the more we talk to C-suite, helping them understand why they should be prioritized, as much as, having insurance in your business, making sure you're cyber safe, all of that stuff. We should be looking at disinformation as a huge risk, not just to our organizations and brands, but also because, one of the things I observe with brands, certainly, I think a lot of discussions, and it's very interesting to hear Jake talk about brands. So a lot of discussion I have with public sector who are taking this very, very seriously because they have to. But with brands, I don't see that same level of urgency in the conversations I have. It seems to me a very reactive, crisis-led approach, and maybe I'm not having the right conversations, but we do need to instill in brands and commercial partners that whilst you might be able to jump from one crisis to the other, the effects it has on your population, your consumers, are much more long-term. So if you don't tackle some of those false narratives and help balance the information ecosystem, it will come to bite you at some point, and it will affect you from a commercial perspective. So we need to have that conversation, I think, from the private sector, the public sector, and in academia.
Brilliant. Shayoni, Jake, and Lexie, I think I shall leave it there. Thank you all so much for coming on this panel. I certainly learned plenty. I hope our audience did as well, and found that an enjoyable and informative session. Just say thanks so much to the PRCA for coordinating this and putting it on. And I hope you all have a glorious rest of PR Ethics Month. Take care. Thanks for joining us.